You're here. Good. We've got you for 2, haven't we, Graeme?
We do.
So 10 minutes. So
yes.
You've watched the drill. I don't need to say to you. Thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to take questions on any of them, or either of them. I'll start with the referendums framework bill. I think this is an appropriate way to run referendums. I am slightly concerned about the option for the government to create sort of a question for a referendum without going through Parliament. But I would note, if it did do that, it would be a non-binding referendum, because to have a contingent, you pass a law and it's like, if this passes in a referendum, you're going to have that question in that law anyway. And so I'm not as concerned, but I think generally you would want questions in referendums to be open to public scrutiny. We have it with the clerk for CIR referendums, citizens initiated referendums. We have it with binding referendums. I think it's just appropriate. Sometimes you would just, wouldn't it be better if you asked the question this way? Which is one of the issues I have with the referendum bill. Is I think the question is quite a bad question. And the question that we had in 1990 was a very simple question. Should the term, choose one option. I support 3 years, I support 4 years. And that's a simple question. Neither of the options in this referendum question is currently written says what the status quo is. It's, do you support this or oppose it? Well, which one's the current one? I don't really know, or is the potential risk. And so I think I go through a few options and examples of past referendum questions, which I think were a lot clearer and easier to understand. And importantly, I'm not sure you even need a question. A lot of the good referendums we've had, the question is choose one option. And then the options are the things you have to understand. And I think that is a good way of doing it. And before I get onto the term of Parliament bill, I will mention the one sort of major concern I have with the mechanics of the referendums framework legislation is it gets rid of some of the protections that we have in elections. And the reason it does that is that there's going to be an election on site. So you go into the voting booth, you give your name, they get an electoral roll and they cross your name. And well, we probably don't need to do that twice. So it makes sense that we're having a referendum at the same time as a general election. Some of the rules don't need to apply because you have those protections built in during the election process. One of them being like the appointment of scrutineers. And so there will be people around, and all those protections that happen during the election will go alongside the referendum. But there is a possibility, and we very much hope it doesn't happen, that the High Court might look at the result of a referendum and say something went wrong here, we need to redo it. And if you're ordered to redo it, the legislation says you hold the new referendum within a certain period of time. That referendum would not be conducted alongside a general election, and none of the protections would apply. And it would be particularly concerning having a High Court having thrown out the result. Okay, we'll do it again. But this time, when you go into the voting booth, no one is going to cross off your name. We are not going to have, those sort of countersigns, the wrong word, I've got a counterfoil with, okay, this is the voting paper from this person. We can check if someone voted twice, because at that rerun of the referendum, if the court orders, that protection isn't in the law, because that protection is excluded, because the assumption and the hope is that these referendums will be alongside general elections. But that does not necessarily have to be the case. Also have the concern about, well, if we have the referendum in 6 months' time, the bill says use the same electoral roll that we had at the referendum. And so people who are imprisoned after that will be able to vote because their name is on the electoral roll. People who turn 18 won't be able to vote. Someone who was in prison and got out, perhaps because the Court of Appeal said this person is innocent and should never have been in prison, won't be able to vote, even though perhaps they should have been at the time. And so it would be, I think, a very useful thing that if we are going to have a referendum, the referendum should be among those who are eligible to vote at that time. And if, simplify things, let's not send out the electoral enrollment update forms to everyone. We use the same roll. And so if you've enrolled in the 3 months after the election, you probably have to cast a special vote. That might be a reasonable accommodation, but you shouldn't have a ban on someone who's 18 and a half from casting a vote in a referendum if they're eligible to vote in it at that date. Anyone has any questions on any aspect? I'll mention.
I'll let you finish because
yes,
I've got 2 questions already.
One thing on the sort of, I don't think I need to convince you either way on the 3 or 4 year term. I need to convince everyone else. This is a perfectly proper thing to have a referendum on. I would very much like it if we're going to have one that was a straight 3 year versus 4 year. I think fundamentally, there are a few things that sort of, a 10-year-old in intermediate school should be able to know maybe who the Prime Minister is, know that Parliament is the body that makes law, know how often we have elections. And a lot of adults won't know how often we have elections if sort of this complicated thing is in place. I think that's sort of one of the fundamental points that, 3 or 4 years, there's arguments either ways, but changing select committees, argument either way, but the two should not be connected in this way.
All right, shall I go to some questions?
Absolutely, thank you.
Right, first of all, Mr. Bates.
Thanks, Chair. In relation to your comments around not repealing the Referendum Act after the period, how much work do you think the bill requires in order to be something that could be permanently on the statute book?
I think it would make sense to bring the CIR into it. You would have the problem, the CIR has different promoter rules, and so the spending limits are different, for example. And there are different advertising rules because the CIR legislation was written.
Just explain CIR.
The Citizens Initiated Referendum legislation. Yeah, thank you, of course. Yeah. The Citizens Initiated Referendum Act, its advertising rules ignore the internet, for example, because it was written so long ago. And so you would need to bring that over. Potentially, if you're going to keep postal voting, then you'd want occasionally you want a postal referendum, so you'd have to bring in the postal voting legislation into it as well. I don't think there would be too much. And if you were to do it once, that would be good, because this is sort of the 3rd one or 4th one of these I've submitted on where either there's been a referendum legislation or referendum rules in a single act. And it seems like a lot of work, to be honest, to do it every time you want to run one of these.
Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the points you raise in your second submission around the 4-year term is around ensuring the question being placed in the referendum is straightforward and simple for people to understand. It's one of the biggest topics we seem to have every time we have a referendum, or such a short question can be often debated around whether people understand it or not. You give the example of supporting the term of Parliament enabling 4-year term legislation amendment Act 2025 coming into force, right?
Yes.
General public's not going to understand that.
No.
How do we make sure, both for this, if it is to go to referendum, and others moving forward, that we use very plain language for those in the general public to understand the referendum?
Open them up always to public comment. And
Prior
so,
to the
that's prior to the referendum. Like, here's the question we're thinking about. And then, like this one, like, oh, here's the question we used in 1990. Here's the questions we used in 1992 and 1993. These are simpler, particularly the 1991. You could just copy that over, to be perfectly honest.
All right, good. Thank you. Ms. Walters?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the comprehensive submissions. Just noting on paragraph 15 of your second submission on the 4-year term, you say the bill somewhat puts the cart before the horse, and then you go on to make some really helpful recommendations. My question is, what do you believe in terms of risk management the preference is? Just looking at your option C, for example, in light of your paragraph earlier, it feels to me like you're suggesting that work needs to be done either through standing orders or through some other form. So that's part one of the question. And the second part is, if C, then in what form? Are you thinking standing orders, or is there a legitimate place for some of those secondary issues, which should be put first, to sit in the legislative space?
Certainly some of them would. I think most of them are probably standing orders. And if you're looking at alternatives, my oral and written submissions on the standing orders review last time had sort of half a dozen options. So when you're talking about opposition control select committees, one idea I mentioned was you have the membership opposition control, so that if you're initiating an inquiry or want to issue a summons or something to have someone come along, the opposition can say, no, we want to have a discussion about this. But when you're dealing with legislation and you're voting on should we make this recommendation, all select committees just essentially do party votes, like you do in the House. And so control of, conducting inquiries or asking people along to give evidence, how long do we allow people to give evidence, those sorts of questions, majority opposition control. But when you're voting on, what changes should we make? National's got 49 MPs, National casts 49 votes in favour of these changes, and that way you could have opposition control for things that it is good to have opposition control for, which is executive scrutiny, but perhaps government control for things that is good to have government control for, which would be legislative scrutiny. And so there are a few options like that I mentioned, I think mostly orally, but also on the written submission to standing orders.
Hey, thank you for a very stimulating submission, or two of them. Thank you.
Yeah, that was quite interesting, mentioning about the referendum frameworks, how the advertising part is based on the pre the internet.
Well, I'm still learning that part because, I always get trapped in the idea of they've got the majority vote, so how do you even have a say as an opposition to something that the Prime Minister's party wants to do?
Yeah, no, it's interesting just hearing the different bits in there, and it's interesting some of the stuff in the referendum framework bill is based on checks and balances of the general election. But if you hold a referendum later, it's interesting some of the things have been brought up in there about, if you're in prison, not in prison, all that sort of stuff in there, considering, there is a proposal to get rid of prisoners having the right to vote, which will probably go through the select committee at some point, considering, and I think that's going to end up causing more shit than what it's worth. But hey, the vibes sound great.
It's tricky because, of course, you need to assess their mental wellness or something, and how do you make it fair? Like different types of incarceration. I'm not sure what the
current law is. If you've been sentenced to 3 years or more, you lose the right to vote. But there was a previous version of the rule that if you were sentenced to just 1 day, you lost the right to vote for that 1 day. But the frustrating part was often, so this was a very common scenario that happens in the justice system, it still does now, is that a person is held on remand. They have the right to vote. It doesn't matter what the law is, because you haven't been found guilty, you haven't been sentenced. They get sentenced to time served. Then as a result, your enrolment letter of, say, you've been removed role, has to be sent to the prison. Now, most people who are sentenced time served don't tend to have forwarding addresses because you're walking out the front door of the courtroom. So you're walking out the front door of the courtroom. You are losing your right to vote. Your right to vote is removed subject to when the registrar of electors is able to do it. It could take up to 2 weeks. If the registrar of electors goes on leave and it's an old election season, you getting taken off the roll could take a month.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then by the time you get taken off the electoral roll, have your letter sent to the prison, have it sent returned to sender, then you turn up election day and go, but I'm on the roll to vote. And I mean, I know someone who got caught out in that of during the COVID, got sentenced for breaching the COVID rules and got sentenced to a month in prison. He didn't know he lost his right to vote. I got him on the electoral roll so he could vote in 2019 for local bodies. He didn't know he had to go through the whole thing again. He goes, but that's what I said. They're changing the law just at the time of when it happened to you. This was the law. You've got to do it again. Oh, what a pain in the butt. Got a roll, and he's been voting every election since. But he never voted before that, and then he got a situation of like, whereas under the current law, he wouldn't have been taken off.
And there are some sentences, like, do you think that would apply to? It's a 3-year. At its base before it's altered by the judge? Is that
no. So it's what's the final determination of the sentence? Right. Like the one who stole my red steamer back in 2022 after the Hamilton It's in the Ballot show.
Yeah.
He was sentenced to 27 months, so he would still technically have his right to vote. So that might be a good one. Whereas if he got sentenced to 36 months, it would be a different story. Actually, thinking about it, he'd probably be out by now, actually, because I mean the sentencing was May 2 years ago. So he, in theory, if he got parole, hopefully he's being treated for drug rehabilitation. That's the big one, considering he was on P at the time of the offence.
Yeah. Most people need rehab.
Yes,
enough push of that. You don't just shut citizens out, so they should always,
Okay, Nick.